So Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, written by Satoshi Nakamoto. Your first question might be, what is Bitcoin? That's it's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. If you're not familiar with Bitcoin, but I highly doubt that, given the sort of like surging popularity that Bitcoin has enjoyed over the past couple of years. But an even better question is, who the heck is Satoshi Nakamoto? We actually don't know quite exactly, but we have like a lot of like hypotheses, and I'll sort of like discuss a few of these. So the first one is Nick Szabo. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. So Nick Szabo is sort of like a very prominent cryptographer that has sort of figured in the Bitcoin scene over the past few years, right? He's been sort of like very instrumental in giving lectures about the inner workings of Bitcoin, sort of like discussing like open sort of platforms, blockchain platforms, so forth and so forth. So one of the reasons is that this guy's capabilities indicate that he's beyond capable of like coming up with something like this. Moreover, like he's actually responsible for some of the core techniques that were used in sort of developing blockchain, the technology underlying Bitcoin. Also, people have speculated that Satoshi Nakamoto is actually a sort of like creative sort of like justly sort of like wordplay, where he kind of like switched the initials of like his first and last name, and sort of like came up with like Japanese names that sort of like fitted that. So Nick Szabo, it's NS, and Satoshi Nakamoto is like SN. So that's that. The second one, perhaps the more convincing one, is actually Dorian Nakamoto. So Dorian Nakamoto is actually an American retired physicist. I think he lives in California, and he is a sort of like very skillful, very like quite involved person in like sort of like secret projects of the government or something that people are sort of like led to believe that he was involved in this project. But like the first giveaway of why this guy was suspected in the first place is his name, right? Dorian Nakamoto. And in fact, the sort of like journalist that did this exposition actually figured out that his birth name was actually Satoshi Nakamoto. And this is like his Japanese sort of birth name, and like his name was like later changed to like Dorian or something. So yeah, that was actually pretty bizarre. And like he acknowledged that he worked on like secret projects and that he's no longer involved, but he denies that secret project was Bitcoin. Our last suspect is actually Hal Finney. Hal Finney is again a very sort of like capable cryptographer who has not only the capabilities to sort of implement this, conceive of this and implement this, like, but also he has the motive, right? Similar to like Satoshi Nakamoto, he's very like a very liberal person that opposes like sort of like government or institutional intrusion and the sort of like privacy of the public. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's actually not. Moreover, Hal Finney was, I'll say this, I'll emphasize this, was the first person besides Satoshi Nakamoto to actually sort of possess Bitcoins, right? So that has been sort of like a huge red flag in the community. Moreover, the sort of figure of like Bitcoin mined by Satoshi Nakamoto is sort of like put out around 1.1 to 1.5 million Bitcoins. That's a lot. That's actually worth way more than 10 billion at this point. $10 billion, right? But those coins have never been touched. right? Those coins have never been used. And in fact, Hal Finney died shortly after the release of this paper, right? Not too sort of like long after. So people are speculating that he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and the fact that like those coins are still like not used indicates that it was him, because he died and he couldn't sort of like move the coins around, obviously. So those are the speculations. And here's the crazy twist, right? Hal Finney actually collaborates with Nick Szabo, and Hal Finney lives very close to Dorian Nakamoto. So there's this sort of like bizarre thing going on that the community hasn't quite figured out yet. So that's that. So like in these presentations, I would literally be walking through the papers and parsing them through. So we'll be starting with the abstract, and we'll get into like every detail within the paper itself. So in the abstract, it states that it's a purely like peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that will allow like payments between peers without going through like a third party, right? One of the core ideas of Bitcoin is avoiding the middleman that sort of like mediates digital transactions, right? Like let's say like when you pay someone cash, or when you sort of like give someone cash for some value provided, there's no third party sort of like mediating that transaction. But when it comes to like digital transactions, a third party is necessary. And why? Well, we've had digital signatures that verify that the sort of like the digital currency was in possession of and sent by a given party, right? Because they digitally signed on the transaction, and the sort of recipient can verify this, and we'll get into this later. But here's the problem, right? The problem is called double spending. What's double spending? Well, double spending is a problem, not much of a problem in sort of like cash transactions, because once you give away cash, you cannot spend the same cash, it's already gone. But with sort of like digital currency, it's actually possible, right? I can sign off on many transactions on this of the same amount that I originally had. Let's say like I have like, I don't know, like $1 million in the bank account, right? I can pay $100,000 to like 20 people. I can sign off on those transactions, and if there's nothing verifying that I'm not overspending, or I'm not sort of like spending the money that I don't have, sorry. So that would sort of enable huge fraudulent activities. And so far, this double spending has been mitigated by financial institutions, but they again are sort of like, there's a lot of problem that we'll see later, and that's for this reason that Bitcoin came into existence, right? It's a brilliant way, as we'll see later, that actually like take care of the necessity for a third party to sort of like get around the problem of double spending. It actually solves it incredibly well, and it solves this problem using a technology called blockchain. It sounds like very cool, but once like it's literally like the technology's architecture is sort of like a one-dimensional sort of like discrete topology where one can conceive of like the blocks as like vertices, and then like they're connected by chains. It's literally like a chain of blocks. That's what it is. So how creative of a name, right? It's actually incredible technology, and we'll discuss it later. So blockchain actually take care of the necessity for sort of like a mitigating third party to avoid double spending. So let's get into the article itself. So if you've noticed, the involvement of like a third party um, actually demands like trust on both the payer and the payee. And they both have to like have incredible trust on the third party, that the third party would sort of like do the right thing, that the third party would like sort of like mitigate it very well. Sure. But one of the core sort of like weaknesses of this model is that transactions are actually like reversible, right? They're not necessarily reversible by the payer. Like I cannot digitally pay you, and then once I get the value that I desired, like let's say like I'm at a grocery and purchasing, and once I pay digitally and I get my grocery, I cannot sort of unpay the amount that I just transferred into your account. However, the banks can, right? Sort of the financial institutions can. And that's a huge problem, right? Because like it's up to them where it's like up to their grace to sort of like reverse the transaction or not. And in fact, like that kind of like has not been much of a problem like until I guess 2008. But like with the sort of financial crisis of 2008, the public sort of like grew weary of the financial institutions that were not quite open, and a lot of their sort of like doings, I guess. So like that trust-based model is like a huge problem. Also, like it leads to like huge centralization of power. That is sort of like non-ideal. A shift of perspective is due. And it's as follows. So Bitcoin is actually a single application of the blockchain technology. The blockchain technology itself is actually a quite revolutionary technology that I think is on par with the revolution of the internet. In fact, I reckon, and a lot of people sort of agree with this opinion, that blockchain underlies the sort of like the internet 3.0, right? So the first internet 1.0 was sort of, obviously the internet was created by like DARPA a while ago, and it was sort of like not that quite involved, right? There were no sort of there wasn't like a lot of service provider on the internet. There weren't like sort of like companies that were doing a lot on the internet. But on like the web 2.0 or like the internet 2.0, I guess, like a lot of huge companies sort of like started emerging, right? Like the biggest companies like by market cap are mostly like social media companies or like internet-based companies, right? So if you take Google, like it's literally like a browsing a company sort of like that sort of offshoot from like a browser, and it later acquired YouTube, which also happens to be the second most popular browser in the world, right? And it has a market cap of like $1 trillion plus at this moment. That's absolutely insane, right? That's the jump that was made from the internet 1.0 to the internet 2.0. Now we are in the age of like the internet 2.0, and if you've noticed, like the power structure has sort of been pushed along to like incredible multi-node centralization, right? It's like there are a lot of companies which are kind of nodes, and like they're like power centers or like power cores, right? But this upcoming phase is like absolute decentralization, and we'll see like how that is sort of like accomplished. But it's an incredible technology. I don't think it's quite appreciated as it should be. Just like the internet was sort of like considered like a gimmick like 20 years ago. So yeah, blockchain is huge, guys. And we'll see why. So I'd like to sort of like bring your attention to an analogy, right? So think of like sort of like STEM research in general, like math research in particular, right? So there are like a lot of universities or academic institutions all over the world. Let's say like here in the United States, there are very like prestigious universities like Harvard, Princeton, like the Institute for Advanced Studies, say Stanford, like that actually carry out incredible like research across the board. So if you specifically take mathematics, there are sort of like departments within these institutions that are working towards solving problems. And let's take, say, like algebraic topology, right? So they're like algebraic topologists in each mathematics department. And mind you, like if these people are actually like working on the same problem, right? Whether they collaborate or not depends on the structure of the system, right? And this is what I mean. And this is sort of like verging into like game theory. But if the way institutions are set up, educational institutions are set up in this case, is one of like competition, where whoever sort of like obtains the answer first is rewarded the most. If that's the goal, if solving the problem first is the goal, then it's in the best interest of like researchers not to collaborate, right? Because like if you're working together, right, and like if only the person who gets to solve the problem first gets the reward, then why would anyone collaborate with anyone? So that's the idea, right? But if the sort of paradigm is that like these institutions sort of like collaborate together to sort of like arrive at the solution in the shortest and most efficient way possible, then collaboration is encouraged, right? So again, it's literally the sort of like setup that has been that is in place, right? That determines the nature of interactions of these sort of like different parties. And like noting the inefficiencies in like math research is not that hard, right? Like it's actually quite common that the same mathematical discoveries are made like by very different people in very different places at around the same time, and they did not have any idea that the other person was working on this. And in fact, the explosion of math research, even as far back as like the days of like Monsieur de Fermat or like Isaac Newton or something, it actually arises from like collaboration. Even like if you go way back until like the day of Newton, where the calculus of variations sort of emerged, and this is like an incredibly important idea in like the development of like classical mechanics, right? He came up with it because he was challenged by one of the Bernoullis, right? And like he responded like he solved it within a day or something, and he responded like with a letter coming up with a solution, and he actually ended up inventing calculus of variations. So that sort of like era of collaboration actually is highly beneficial, right? And like we're seeing like an emergence of like an incredibly well-connected sort of like research community within mathematics, and it's absolutely beautiful, very efficient. People are collaborating literally across continents, and this avoids the sort of like repeated, very inefficient sort of like process where different people are working on the same problem, and they're not collaborating, they're not helping each other, they're reinventing the wheel in their own way. And that's why you have like theorems like the divergence theorem, is also known as like Gauss's theorem, but at the same time it's also called Ostragradsky's theorem, and it's actually exclusively called Ostragradsky's theorem in Russia. So we avoid that. The same with financial institutions, and the same with institutions in general that are based on trust. That's what Bitcoin arrives at. So now coming back to like institutions, as I've tried to argue using the analogy, like the setup that exists contemporarily, it's actually like very efficient for inter sort of like institution collaborations. So, and as I've tried to mention, like one of the core problems of this like third party sort of like mediator is that they're able to reverse transactions based on the decisions that they arrive at. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. Now comes the question. If irreversibility is the Achilles heel of this like trust-based system, how do you introduce irreversibility? Well, someone who's like familiar with the second law of thermodynamics and the sort of the core idea as to why time is sort of like irreversible, would understand that it's like a game of probabilities, right? So time is irreversible because of the idea of entropy, right? And entropy is like a non-decreasing quantity, right? It's increasing, not strictly increasing, but it never decreases, right? So it's a non-decreasing quantity. And think of entropy as sort of disorder, but in a way, interestingly enough, as Cloud Shannon sort of like demonstrated, entropy is actually like information. Ergo, information is disorder. We'll discuss that paper like sometime later. It's a beautiful paper again. But so consider this, right? Like, consider a balloon, an inflated balloon, and an empty room, in a vacuum. And consider sort of like letting go of the vacuum, sort of like having a clamp that would like slowly sort of like undo itself, right? Like there's no one in the room except the balloon, the inflated balloon, right? It's a vacuum. And it's slowly, the clamp slowly opens and it sort of like lets out air. And like, because there's a positive pressure gradient from like the balloon onto the room, the air is gonna like slowly like disperse, right? It's very, that's very intuitive, right? The balloon is going to like slowly deflate, right? And sort of like let out air. And here's the thing, right? It's like you might actually go about and sort of like pick up literally every molecule, every air molecule, and put it back, like suck it back and sort of like reinflate the balloon, tie it back up. You can do that, right? But that's a lot of energy expended, right? What we want to consider is like an isolated system, right? Like let that room be closed, that vacuum room, or like void or whatever. Like if you want to avoid like the vacuum field or something, as if it matters, but whatever. So if we want to do that, right? It's very improbable. Like it's not impossible, right? It's virtually impossible for the balloon to sort of like reinflate, right? To reinflate, even for like a split second, and for it to sort of like reinflate and persist is absolutely impossible, right? It's virtually impossible. So that's the idea of entropy, right? It's like once the air is out of the balloon, like it will not naturally come back to its initial state, right? And as a lot of these processes are like going on in the universe, right, it's very improbable that they would sort of like automatically revert into their like initial stages or like initial states. That's the idea of entropy, right? And the question becomes like, how do you introduce entropy? Well, blockchain. Blockchain actually accomplishes like a lot. It's sort of like a panacea of like for the problems that we've so far considered. It actually solves a lot of problems simultaneously. And that's incredible, but it's also not surprising because like most of the individual problems have been like individually solved. but it's like tying them all together and like sort of providing the missing parts. That is like sort of the brilliance of this publication. So what blockchain achieves is actually like an independent, like trustless system, right? It gets rid of like the third party. That's one. And second, it actually sort of like introduces entropy that would make it like infeasible, meaning like virtually impossible, as like especially like as time rolls on, for the sort of like transactions or the processes to be reversed. And we'll see this sort of like in detail later. So now we're moving to the details of like how Bitcoin is structured. We're going to start with the bare bones sort of feature of a digital exchange value system, transactions, right? And with Bitcoin, we're going to transact Bitcoins, digital currency. So think of a coin as sort of like an initially sort of like minted or like mined, and then sort of like having a series of owners, right, who've exchanged it like so far. That coin is going to contain information about all previous owners up to this point. Not private information, but sort of like cryptographic information. And what the current owner does to sort of transact that coin is to sign off on a transaction that takes that coin from this person's account or possession to another person, right, and sort of transfer it. How's it done? Well, this has been around for quite some time. The person who's going to sort of like authorize a transaction is going to sign using their private key that only they have, right? And they're going to send it to the receiver using the public key of the receiver. And the receiver is going to receive it because their public key is public and anyone can send them stuff. And they can verify, and this is the beauty of like cryptography, that the sender was in fact who the sender claims they were by using the public key of the sender, right? Like the receiver can verify that the sender signed using their private key by using the public key of the sender. And you might say, wait, how? Like how? If they don't know the sort of signature, if the signature is private, then how are they going to, like, how does the public key sort of verify that the private key was indeed used? Well, that's the beauty of cryptography. And underneath, there's a beautiful sort of like application of like number theory. It's really modular arithmetic underneath. And I'd love to go into that, especially like I'm a big fan of like the RSA encryption, and the number theory sort of is not really involved. It's very straightforward. But we'll discuss that paper like in later in future videos. So I'll skip on that. The sort of owner two, the person who just took over ownership, is going to transfer the coin in the similar process, right? And like it gets transacted as such. Now the problem, as we've discussed before, is double spending, right? This is the problem that has not been so far solved so aptly in the sort of like digital ecosystem without the need for a third party involvement. So far the sort of solution proposed involves a third party, and this is usually like a mint. So the mint would have a record of each transaction, right? And so they would, like, let's say like owner one is transferring sort of some amount to owner two. The mint would know about this transaction, and when owner one tries to sort of like double spend, the mint is going to step in and sort of unauthorize that transaction, right? Sort of forbid that transaction. So the mint is sort of the trusted body in this relationship, and everything depends on the mint, on the well functioning of the mint, and so forth. So if you've noticed, it seems like the only way to sort of like prevent double spending is to be aware of all transactions, just like the mint, right? And how can we do that? Well, the brilliance sort of like of blockchain is that instead of having a central authority that sort of has this ledger of transactions, why not make a public ledger that is announced to the public? Like, why not make everyone the mint? And you're like, whoa, like everyone's going to quit their jobs and sort of work at the mint now? You're going to sort of like abandon all of our life pursuits? No. Your computational power, your personal computational power, is the one that is going to serve as the mint. So every node, or like you can think of this as every person, but instead like every sort of like CPU aggregate or like computational core, is going to like serve as a voter, right? And we'll see the details as things go. But what's going to happen is that the payer is going to issue the transaction to the payee, and the payee, in order to be assured of the absence of double spending in that transaction, the payee only needs to know that this is the first transaction that this coin has been sort of like sent to, like that the payee is the first person receiving this transaction, right? That's it. If you're the first, right, that person can sort of go ahead and like double spend. It's none of your problem. But this is the beauty, right? Let's say the payer pays you and you're payee number one. Great, you're the first one. The sort of the computational nodes would vote that it is indeed the first, and you're happy. You go along your way. Pay number two comes, and pay number two is paid by the payer, the same amount that you were given, and the person is trying to sort of carry out the same transaction twice to a different party. What's going to happen is like the nodes are going to vote, and they're going to vote that it's not the payee number two is not the first payee, that this transaction has already been done. So the payee is going to reject this transaction, right? Because not necessarily the payee, but the node is going to vote against this transaction, right? The mint, the automatic mint. So that's how it's going to go. Okay, now let's move on to timestamp server. Again, this is nothing new. This has been around for quite some time. In fact, Satoshi Nakamoto actually proposes this in a very sort of like funny way to demonstrate that this thing can actually be done in very like rudimentary ways, even using newspapers or like using net post or something. But the idea of a timestamp is, recall that we said that the nodes vote whether like the transaction was the first one or not, and inherently like that implies sort of their awareness of a chronological order of all transactions, right? So we better have time factored in this, right? And this has been very well accomplished by timestamp server. The idea of a timestamp server can actually be easily understood as follows, right? It's basically, the system is basically a function from the sort of the continuous sort of like one-dimensional space of time. Think of it as like an affine space, onto the space of like discrete transactions, right? What it's basically doing is like it's continuously adding sort of transactions and hashing them one after the other, right? It's literally like creating an order of transactions, and the timestamp, like the timestamp itself, as we'll later, could be used in the hashing itself, right? Now we're gonna jump into proof of work. But before we actually discuss that, I want to sort of like touch upon the concept of like hashing. And the most famous or the sort of widely used hashing algorithm is called SHA 256, or like secure hashing algorithm 256. It's actually developed by the NSA. And the idea is as follows, right? Hashing is sort of a one-way process that takes information and gives it a unique label, a fixed characters, right? So if you're probably wondering what the 256 refers to, it's actually 256 bits, referring to the word length of the output. So in hashing, there's something called the avalanche effect, right? The avalanche effect is as follows. So given let's say like a text document that is being hashed, a slight change in any area, like let's say you change one letter A to a B, the hash value is going to be completely different. So if you can sort of like imagine creating sort of like a metric from one hash to another, where let's say like you square the difference and add it up. Like let's say like the first entry in the first hash is a 1 and the first entry in the second hash is like a 7. Then the difference would be a 6 and squared it's 36. So you add those. If you come up like if that's sort of like, I think that should be a valid metric, I reckon. But I could check the criteria. But that metric is like a slight change in any input, right? In the sort of like the input into the hashing algorithm is going to drastically change the metric, right? So being close in the input space has nothing to do with being close in the like hashing space, the hashed space. And that's why underlies the security capabilities of like hashing, because it's very hard to like reverse engineer. That's where the irreversibility arises from. Now let's look back to like the idea of proof of work. The idea of proof of work is as follows, right? The way it's set up is such that we want for like a given input, like let's say I give you like a text document, and then I give you a leeway to sort of like change, let's say like 4 bits or like 4 bytes, so that you sort of fulfill this condition. And the condition is as follows, right? The condition is that given a transaction, when someone is hashing that transaction and adding it to the blockchain would have a condition that there should be this many zeros at the beginning of the hashing, right? So like let's say like it's a 64 word hashing algorithm, right? It's gonna say like the first 4 words have to be 0. And you might say, okay, that's interesting. Like how does that relate to the proof of work? Well, sort of randomly scouring like the word space and then picking up words and then putting it in the 64 word sort of space, you can generate a random like 64-bit word like very easily. That's easy, right? What's hard, and in fact what's exponentially hard, is to generate a 64-bit word such that the initial 4 words or the initial 5 words are fixed, right? That's actually pretty hard. Why is that hard? Well, that reduces like, let's say you have like word space that includes like the 10 digits plus the 26 like Latin or like English alphabetical letters. That's 36 possible words per space, right? So the probability of you like scouring the entire like 64 the entire word space and sort of like randomly selecting 64-bit words, and then coming up with for like a 64-bit word that fixes the first 4-bit words is actually 1/36 to the power of 4. Right? It's a very hard problem, right? So the proof of work concept is that like a lot of CPU sort of computational power has to be dedicated to sort of scouring the space and finding sort of a hash value for a given transaction, not by varying the transaction itself, but by varying like an additional sort of like degree of freedom that we call nonce, that we'll see later, such that this condition is satisfied. So this is the mining process, right? You're investing energy, and like once the hashing for the given transaction that satisfies the condition is found, then the hashing can be accepted by the blockchain and then added, and then the CPU gets a reward for that. That's how it goes. Now recall that the hashing algorithm not only encodes the transaction, the nonce, as we've just discussed, but it also encodes for the previous hashing, right? So what's very interesting about that is this, right? So once a given transaction is hashed, right, any change in the previous transaction's hashing would actually change the hashing for this transaction as well, right? So let's say an attacker comes and wants to sort of like change a given transaction, right? Let's say like it's 10 blocks back from the current end. What's going to happen is that once that that hashing for that transaction is changed, right, then it's going to change the hashing for literally all the following 9 blocks up to the end, right? So this attacker has to like redo the proof of work for all 10, right? Like he has to rehash so that the 4 or 5 zeros at the end condition is satisfied again, so that like they're valid, considered like valid transactions by the blockchain. That's a lot of computational power, and the blockchain grows at a very rapid rate. So it's not feasible for like any sort of like centralized node with like decent computational power to sort of overpower the whole network. It's not feasible, right? That's where the irreversibility comes from. If in fact the attacker controlled, like, let's say 51% of the computational power, right, they can in principle like reverse the transactions, right? They can in principle like sort of corrupt the network because they can overpower it, and like they can do the proof of work faster than the remaining 49% of the distributed network. But as you'll see later, like another brilliant feature of Bitcoin is the incentive sort of like setup. There are several issues that might arise that Bitcoin actually solves really well. One of them is that the IP address per vote versus the CPU per vote. So if the Bitcoin was set up so that like every IP address has one vote, then what's gonna like in voting like which transaction comes first, then someone might control like an incredible amount of like an incredible number of like IP addresses, so that they can easily overpower the network without necessarily expending a lot of like computational power and so forth. But the one CPU, one vote policy ensures that it's computational power that actually is involved in sort of the voting process. And it makes it very expensive and actually non-beneficial for any attacker to overpower the network. Any attacker with enough computational power, as we will see later, is better off mining instead of corrupting the network. Because if they have so much computational power, then they would be mining much faster and they would gain so much value than if they were to overpower the network. So that's one thing. Another thing that was considered by Satoshi Nakamoto is the possibility that, like, given Moore's law, computer sort of speeds are going to increase exponentially. So let's say, like, with the advent of quantum computers, it becomes very easy to sort of like satisfy the condition of four zeros at the beginning of like a 64-bit word. What this does, the solution for this is like a moving average, right? So it's a feedback mechanism where let's say computer, like the network keeps solving these transactions like very fast, right? Then what the blockchain is going to do is like it's going to change the average number of zeros that is required to like for the condition. It's going to make a leap from like 4 zeros to 5 or 6, right? It's going to make it harder, right? So that like the network solves sort of hashes the transactions like much slower. Now let's dive deeper into like the setup of the network itself, and the sort of procedural proceedings that take place. So at first, whenever like a new transaction is issued, right, they're broadcasted to like all the nodes. It's on par with transactions being announced at the mint, right? And then the like nodes collect these new transactions into a block, right? So mind you that like the hashing algorithm, the blockchains, each block is actually not necessarily like a single transaction. It contains multiple transactions that are hashed as one transactions, and we'll see later like how that's efficiently sort of like achieved. And then each node is going to work on finding a difficult proof of work for its block, right? It's going to sort of like try to hash that block and generate like a hashing output that satisfies the condition that we discussed before. So all the nodes sort of like receive the broadcast, and they verify that all these transactions have not already been spent, meaning like they check for like double spending, and then it's like they vote by accepting this block. And this is how, right? They express their like assent by taking whatever was broadcasted, which is like one block longer than like the previous step, right? And it's the longest now. It's the longest accepted chain, and every node is gonna start working on that as well. So that's how it progresses, right? So they express their agreement or consensus by starting to work on the transaction or like the blockchain that was just announced or broadcasted. So it's a beautiful race that's going on where so given a transaction, two different versions of the sort of like the block could be broadcasted, right? So what's going to happen is like some nodes might receive one before the other because of like physical proximity of signal transmission, and whenever like they receive two different blocks, this sort of like simultaneously or something, they're going to like start work on the first block, but they're going to keep the second block that they just received, right? The second alternative, right? And other blocks are working on it. So if whichever like one becomes longer first, right? Whichever one is quote unquote voted for by the network would win, right? And like the one that was just like not voted for would be sort of like discarded, right? And it's not necessary that like transactions reach all nodes, because they could be solved way before they reach all nodes, right? But what matters is like they reach many nodes and they get solved and they are attached to the like blockchain. And there are like other technicalities that the Bitcoin algorithm sort of addresses. There are like two models of incentives that Bitcoin offers, right? The first one is like through mining, new coins are like issued, right? It's like for carrying out the proof of work, each node is sort of like awarded a certain amount of Bitcoin, right? For carrying out that work. And like Satoshi Nakamoto actually proposes that the incentive, like once Bitcoin has sort of like entered circulation with a given amount, right? It's with a large enough amount. They're going to move from the mining model of incentives to the sort of transaction-based incentive, right? And this is how it goes. When someone carries out a transaction, right, they pay a fee, right? That's how it goes. And I think that model has started to dominate, I guess, because there are like a lot of companies right now that are like quite involved in sort of like carrying out like transactions fees for buying and selling and transferring sort of cryptocurrencies. So that's the second phase, and we're way past the commencement of this phase. As I've tried to like allude to before, the brilliance of Bitcoin doesn't actually arise from the sort of like invention of like an entire new paradigm. Instead, it actually like is more of like a shift in perspective, right? It's bringing together like a lot of components that were already developed and sort of putting them together to give this amazing functionality, right? So it's a unison of like various cryptographic ideas that have been around for quite some time. Hashing algorithm that has been around for quite some time. Timestamp servers, all of those. And also the economics aspect of it, like sort of like working through that with this much maturity is actually quite incredible, right? So the brilliance of like the incentive mechanism is that beyond the sort of cybersecurity or like cryptographic measures that were in place that make it harder to like overpower the network to begin with, that's like the entropy introduced by the sort of like proof of work that is sort of put in by all the nodes, and it's very hard to reverse anything because like whatever like you want to reverse, you have to redo the proof of work for all the steps that were reversed, right? Or like all the steps beyond the primary point of like change, right? And that makes it virtually impossible to do so. So that's brilliant in itself, but at the same time, the Satoshi Nakamoto has put in place an economic measure for cybersecurity, and that's this incentive mechanism, right? It's not only hard to overpower the network, but it's actually economically non-feasible to do so, even if you have the power to do so, right? Even if you sort of overpower the cryptographic sort of bulwarks that have been put in place, you still have to like overcome the economic incentive. Right? It's like if you have so much computational power to overpower the network, why not just use that to actually work for the network? Because that is such like an overwhelming economic gain compared to actually destroying the network, which results in no one gaining anything. So that for me, like that actually requires like a very insightful sort of like thought process. So like I really appreciate like how those components were like put together. Now moving to section 7, where Satoshi talks about optimizing disk space usage. And this is obtained by a Merkle tree, right? So recall that a block is actually not a single transaction. It contains multiple transactions. And Satoshi's idea is that like instead of hashing each transaction as a block,
why not just hash the block of transactions as a whole? And the way to do that is sort of to generate a hash for like each transaction, and then combine those hashes in a Merkle tree, and then come up with like a hash for the entire block. So once that's done, the computer doesn't need to store like all transactions, right? It's once the hash is generated in a Merkle tree, like the tree can be pruned. And then just the sort of like the root hash can be used to like hash this block, generate like this block, along with the other components that we've discussed, that we'll now see. A block header is about 80 bytes, right? And these are the components that get into the final hashing for the entire block, right? The header is the word that is hashed at the end and that generates the hash for the entire block. So let's break this down, actually. So the 4 of the 80 bytes that are used are actually like the version of the blockchain. The version basically dictates the rules for which block should be accepted and which block should be rejected, right? We're not going to get into the detail of this. The second one is the previous block's like block header hash, the hashed output of the previous block's header, right? That's 32 bytes. The third one is the Merkle root hash that we've just discussed of the current block, right? And it's 32 bytes as well. The fourth one is actually the timestamp. And interestingly enough, the timestamp actually uses something called the Unix epoch time. And it's 4 bytes long. And what this basically does is like it actually counts time units since January 1st, 1970. So we're how many time units have elapsed since then. So that's how the Unix epoch time sort of like is counted, right? It's like before 1970, like no one cares, but after that, it's like it starts with 1 time unit and like it's sort of like accrues. The remaining 4 bytes are used for something called end bits. I'm not going to get into that. The last one is a nonce, which we've discussed as the sort of like the core ingredient in the idea of like proof of work, right? It's the nodes vary the nonce so that like the condition for the number of zeros at the beginning is like satisfied. That like they basically vary the nonce. Now let's come to section 8, simplified payment verification. And this is sort of like the basic idea of here is that like it's easier to like recognize than to sort of like process, or like there's like an interesting parallel with problem in psychology of recognition versus recall. So recognizing that you've seen something is much easier than recalling something that you've sort of like previously encountered. Like recognizing a poem is like much easier than recalling a poem, I think. This is kind of a very similar idea in that to verify that a given transaction has been accepted by the node, like a user only needs to like sort of like keep the header of the headers of like each block, and then verify that like the transaction belongs to one of these blocks, right? And it's been accepted by the longest chain. And the fact that like there are like multiple blocks after like this block that contains that transaction indicates that this has been already like well accepted. So that's how one verifies it. But in fact, this makes it sort of like vulnerable, again, to like attackers with like enough computational power, because they can actually like generate much longer like chains, blockchains that are actually like contain invalid transactions, right? Because they can overpower the
honest notes. But there are like a lot of measures in place, as already discussed. But besides that, I think Satoshi like recommends that businesses that do like frequent payments, frequent transactions, run. Okay, so the last thing that we ought to discuss about are sort of kind of technical aspects of Bitcoin, and technical issues that it resolves, and sort of like that are quite related to like privacy and the efficiency of like the network as a whole. So section 9 is about combining and like splitting values, and by values I mean like the coins, right, which in turn are sort of like transactions. So in the Bitcoin model, like as I've tried to sort of emphasize before, each block contains multiple transactions, right? So you don't need like a single block for every transaction. You can use the Merkle root to hash multiple transactions and generate like a single block header. We're using the other inputs for the hash as well. So that's one thing. That's how it kind of takes like transactions in bulk and then produces like an output. And the output is usually like two things. The first one is like the amount that has been sort of like sent to like different addresses, and the second one would be like the amount that the sender gets, I guess. But this model might have changed in the current sort of like system as a whole. Maybe perhaps not in Bitcoin, but like in other currencies. I'm not sure. But I think that is highly emphasized in the workings of Bitcoin. Another thing that Satoshi sort of like claims that Bitcoin solves is the fan-out problem, where one transaction depends on the completion of another transaction, which depends on the completion of yet another transaction. So finding out meaning like one sender transaction like influence like a lot of transactions that subsequently follow. This kind of thing won't happen because every transaction would like take place on its own terms, isolated from like other transactions. So there's no precondition for any transaction to take place. So I think that prevents these sort of like hyperconnectivity, or like a single point or like node that gives rise to like other transactions that depend on it in turn. So that's one thing that sort of stands out. And I think Satoshi emphasizes this by noting that like because there's no finding out, because there's no interdependence of transactions one upon the other in chronological order, this prevents the need to keep like the history of like a single transaction and everything that follows. We don't need to do that so that's a big bonus. The second to last point we're gonna sort of tap into is privacy. Actually, I think this is like one of the most important technical aspects that Bitcoin has set out to resolve and actually like resolved quite successfully, right? So in the traditional sort of like privacy model, what actually happens is that a client accessing like sort of like a secure network has privacy from the general public, right? It actually, the identity of the user is completely revealed. In fact, that's how you get access to these secure networks, right? By completely sort of giving away your identity. That's how you register, like to get a bank account. You even have to supply not only your name, your birth date, your address, a lot of other information about that could be used to uniquely identify you, like even to like your mother's maiden name or something, all the way up to like social security number, right? That's crazy. It's like to get protection from the wider public, we would trust these institutions, which are in fact sort of like concentrated cores, or like a subset of the general public. So it's like to protect ourselves from 99% of a given set, we're going to completely give ourselves over to the 1%
subset of that given set, right? It's an incredible trade-off that we as a society have decided to make, and in fact, this model has worked decently for like centuries so far. But the thing is, like, we have come to observe that first, these institutions are not quite worthy of the high esteem of trust that we entrust upon them, right? They're as fallible or like as culpable as like any other institution or any other body, because they as institutions have their own interest. And with so much information comes so much power that they can in turn use to the sort of advancement of their interests, which can sometimes be, and oftentimes it is, against the interests of the public that they serve. So we've seen that like time and time again. So that's one thing. But second, and I think this is much more important, because these nodes, by design, are concentrated sort of like stores of like very valuable information. They're fertile grounds for malicious attacks, right? Like this, we saw this like happening in 2017 with like Equifax, 2017-2016, where Equifax was entrusted with like the private information of like a lot of people all over the world, I guess. But especially like in the United States, like they kept credit scores of people, and like they had their social security number and all, like a lot of information about their identity. And Equifax was hacked, right? So Equifax was a single point of failure for the very valuable information of people, right? So I think this is an even bigger issue regarding like privacy. So Bitcoin's design, like using the incredible design of like blockchain, or the incredible technology per se, has managed to create like a new privacy model, right? It's like there's a new divide between identity and transactions, as opposed to like the sort of traditional models where identity is a sort of the revelation of identity is required to get entry into the secure system. Now, identity has nothing to do with sort of gaining entry into the security into the secure system. Identity and is sort of like kept very personal. So like when someone tries to like access the blockchain network, they're not required. There's no central authority requiring so much verification of their identity, and in the process gaining so much information about their identity. The new privacy model separates identities and transactions, and it takes out the third party, right? So, and the public serves as a sort of the mediating and verifying sort of body, but the public has no idea what the identity of the parties involved are. Like no one knows what the nodes are, including the nodes themselves. This is like an incredible design model for privacy, and also like sort of diving deeper into like the Bitcoin sort of like architecture, right? We noticed that like new sort of like keys are generated for like for nodes, or like I guess we can say like individuals that are carrying some transactions, like they're generated like every now and then, so that like they, like a single person doesn't have like a single sort of a single key that is visible to the public. But like let's say like someone, and like Satoshi admits this, right? Like let's say like someone is making like very frequent like transactions in a given time period, like that those multiple transactions would be tied to the same key, and there's a possibility that in due time there might actually be a way to sort of like link the keys to like that single sort of individual. But the sort of the feasibly maximum extent to which this information could yield results would be like, oh, okay, like these 5 transactions have the same key, therefore they must belong to the person, to the individual with this key, right? That's the maximum amount of information that we can derive from feasibly, and that's kind of useless because like that person's key is going to change like the next day.
So that's a huge sort of like prevention methodology to begin with. But at the same time, given that like sort of the advancement of technology, there might be like other ways that arise in the future that might get around this problem, and we don't know this. And Satoshi admits this, like that it's possible, but so far as Satoshi can see, and like so far as I can see, in fact, and so far as it has been discussed so far, there's no feasible way to like reveal the identity of the sort of parties involved. In fact, like think about this, like it's much easier to sort of reveal the identity of people in sort of centralized node systems that like the traditional systems than it is in the blockchain, right? It's the blockchain is way more secure than the traditional. So like if I would rather be worried about the sort of traditional systems than this one regarding their cybersecurity, and they're fine so far. So like I'm not even worried about the security of the blockchain at the moment. So yeah, but there are possible points of failure that Satoshi indeed admits, but this privacy model is quite incredible. The last section is about calculations, and this is sort of the section where Satoshi lays out the mathematical, not quite foundations, but kind of justifications for the security of Bitcoin. And the scenario that the calculation sort of considers is as follows. So remember that the blockchain is actually like a linear chain of blocks. There's only one blockchain on which blocks are like added by the network. So the scenario that Satoshi considers is like as such. Say like we have a given sort of block, and at a time as we've covered like before, it's possible for two different sort of like chains to emerge, and the longer one would be accepted by the network, right? And the shorter one would be like let go, and that sort of orphan chains would be terminated, right? We've covered that before. Now what Satoshi considers is that's, as again we've discussed before, is that could be a point of entry for a malicious attack. And this is how. We consider a scenario where an attacker tries to outgenerate the honest nodes, the chain generated by the honest nodes. So the attacker can actually like try to generate the longest chain, and then have that accepted, and that chain would obviously contain invalid transactions. But to begin with, the best part about sort of the blockchain setup is that honest nodes will never sort of accept, that is, will never verify invalid transactions containing them, meaning like they would not validate invalid transactions that claim that that demand their validation, right? Even like they might do the proof of work for like other transactions that do not involve them, but they would never do so for invalid transactions that contain them, or invalid transactions that have been spent. So that's one. So that prevents, that itself is like a huge security bulwark. But even then, so this restricts the attacker to only one sort of path to attack, and that is the attacker cannot rewrite other transactions that involve two different parties without the attacker, right? Like that's not going to happen, because again, these nodes are not going to accept transactions that involve them, which are invalid. So the only thing that he or she, the attacker, or they can do is sort of like accept invalid transactions that contain them, right? Meaning that they can only accept invalid transactions that they themselves have been involved in. And this is how. So the attacker could transfer Bitcoin, right? And like in a given transaction. And what the attacker can do is this. They can take back what they've sent.
And another sort of marvelous security measure to begin with, built into the blockchain itself, is that the receiver has to sign on the transaction to validate that. And like that, the receiver would only generate a new key for the transaction once the transaction has been generated and received, right? So the attacker cannot work on like a longer chain that contains the invalid transaction and then send the transaction to the receiver for verification. That cannot happen. The only way that the attacker can deceive the receiver is that once the transaction has to be sent to be signed with a new generated key by the receiver. So the attacker has one shot. Once the receiver receives that transaction, the attacker can then start immediately working on a new block that is longer than the honest change, right? And that way the attacker can get their money back or their Bitcoin back. So that itself is like a very narrow window for attack. But even that scenario, as we'll see, is like completely infeasible for even sort of like rudimentary sort of setups of the blockchain, let alone like thousands and thousands of nodes with incredible computational power as a whole. So this is the way we're gonna approach things, right? We're gonna consider like the binomial random walk, and this is what it means. So the binomial random walk it kind of like fuses the competition. It sits right in the middle between like the honest chains and the attacker's chain, and this is what it does. Whenever the binomial we'll have a variable that keeps track of whatever like the honest, whenever like the honest nodes get one block added to them, right? The binomial our variable would increase by one, right? And then whenever like the the attacker's node gain one step one block ahead, our variable would quote unquote increase by -1. And this is like the more positive our variable is, right, the more ahead the honest nodes are. So think of this, right? Like we start at 0. Let's say the honest nodes generate one block, and so that's a +1, and the attacker's chain generates its own block. That's -1. So we're back at 0. So the difference between the two is 0. So by giving 1 to the honest nodes and -1 to the attacker's node, we're gonna like at a later time, like after several like discrete steps, we're gonna have like a number, whether it's like positive or negative, right? It's probably gonna be positive, because the honest nodes have a much higher probability, because of their computational power, right? So what's like if we have a decently large number, that indicates that the honest node is so far ahead than the malicious node or the attacker's node. Length of block, right? So that's what the binomial sort of random walk indicates. And this is used for like a lot of processes that have sort of like discrete increase with like given probabilities. And it's like this is used to model like stock market prices, like a lot of physical processes as well. So this is a very popular sort of modeling tool where you have like one thing happening and then another, and they sort of like have a given antagonistic contributions to a fixed quantity, and they have their own complementary probabilities, right? Like one could be the case that like +1 would occur like 70% of the time and -1 would occur like 30% of the time, and you would run this this process, this binomial sort of like random walk. And it is called a random walk because there's a way to actually like conceive of the random walk as like an actual walk, where we could plot a sort of like discrete so we start with a point 0, 0, right? And the x-axis like discretized like to 0, 1, 2, 3 or something, that counts the steps, right? And at each step, we either gain 1 or minus 1. And those values should be plotted on the y-axis, right? So let's say like on the first step, we get a plus 1. So we'd be at the point 1, 1. And then again, another plus 1. We would be at the point 2, 2. And then the third step, we get minus 1, right? And then we get, so we were at 2, 2. So our x increases by 1, so that's 3. And our y decreases by 1. That's 1. So it'll be at 3, 1. So like if you plot this, the point would move up and down, up and down, up and down. And it could like take various sort of paths. But on average, like it would actually like yield, like sort of hover around the expected value. But oftentimes it can overshoot. It could like sort of like shoot quite high, and it can often like dip quite low. So it's a very interesting process on its own. So that's that. The specific way with which we're going to use the binomial random walk model is to consider like the gambler's ruin problem. And this is how it goes. Gamblers, when they're playing, right? So they would start with like a deficit, right? Like they like, let's say like a very addicted gambler has lost like a lot of games, right? So they lost a lot, or like they owe a lot to the casino. And let's say like they're given infinite trials. But if you know the adage or like the saying that goes like the house always wins, it is true, because like probabilities are sort of like always in the favor of like the casinos. And in turn, like they provide entertainment. That's how things are set up. It's not a trick, or like it's not illegal or something. Everybody should, or at least everybody knows, or everybody should know this. But they provide entertainment in return. So like a gambler like could start behind the casino, right? Let's say like they lost like $10,000, right? They've been playing the whole night. They lost $10,000. And let's say they're given like an infinite trial, right? Like let's say they're given like I don't know. You can think of this as like trials where like they would either lose or gain money. So they could try as many times as they want. Our question would be like, how probable is it for the gambler to actually like compensate for their loss and then overtake the casino in terms of like returns? Like how can they beat the casino? And again, I've tried to like emphasize, it's in the casino's favor continue this game, because like in the long run, the expected value or would be like a positive return for the casino. So how do we model this? Where let's say like instead of thinking in terms of like money, let's actually like think in terms of like the blockchain, which it's actually like an easier way to like visualize the process. The process itself is like quite straightforward. So let's say like the honest nodes are z blocks ahead, right? Like let's say like the honest could be like 10 blocks ahead, 100 blocks ahead, right? All of those things. So we ask, what is the probability that the attacker would eventually like catch up to the honest node and like overtake the honest node? If that happens, then the malicious chain or like the attacker's chain would be accepted because it's the longest, and then the attacker's invalid transactions would be accepted in the blockchain like permanently, or for the time being that chain keeps on leading, because the other chain would be dropped if the lead continues for like a significant amount of time. So we ask ourselves like let's say the honest nodes are like z blocks ahead, right? How probable is it for at each step, like remember the binomial sort of like random walk, how probable is it like at each step we'd get like a -1, like an addition, a lead for the attacker chain instead of like the honest chain? And that actually turns out to be Q over P, right? For each step, right? Because like with probability Q over P, the attacker can like take over like at each step. We're not considering like the Z steps as a whole. At each step, there's a Q over P probability the attacker would like catch up. No, sorry. So there's a probability of Q over P at each step that the attacker would like catch up at that step. And when you factor in like the whole Z steps that the attacker is like lagging behind, the attacker has to like win at each step, at all of those steps. And that's going to be Q over P to the Z, right? Because it's multiplicative, right? It's like the attacker has to win the first step and the second step and the third step and the fourth step. And it's very obvious that, and this is the case where like Q, the probability of the attacker, well, Q is the probability that the attacker would like win the next block, and P is the probability that the honest node should have win the next block. So Q over P, if Q is less than P, right? And this sort of ties back to the computational power that they have. If the attacker's computational power is like less than the honest node's computational power, then we can see that the probability that the attacker's node would catch up drops exponentially with every step, right? Because Q is less than P, Q over P is less than 1. So something that is less than 1 raised to the power of Z for large Z's approaches 0, right? Its limit is actually like 0. So it's actually very small. The probability is very small. But if like P is like less than Q, then the attacker can actually like overtake the network. But we know that the honest nodes have like significant computational power. So given that, so we've discussed what's going to happen for a single Z, right? Like given like a Z, a random Z, what's the probability? And we just saw that it's Q over P to the Z if the attacker is lagging behind in terms of probability, right? It's if the attacker has a smaller probability of generating the next block, and like the attacker's like Z blocks behind, then the probability that the attacker would catch up is very low. It's Q over P to the Z. But if the attacker has like a higher probability of generating the next block, then the attacker would definitely catch up at some point. In a limiting scenario, like the attacker would eventually take over the network if the attacker has a higher probability of generating the next block, ergo a higher computational power than the honest nodes. So to sort of like tie up the whole the solution to the whole problem, let's actually take the perspective of the receiver, right? So the receiver could wait, let's say, until like a given number of blocks has been added by the owner's nodes since the reception of the call for that transaction from the attacker, right? Let's say like it's called the recipient. Those Z blocks are being generated, right? Waits like Z blocks before like verifying the transaction. Attacker could generate any number of blocks. The way we quantify this is using a Poisson distribution. So a Poisson distribution is sort of like a discrete distribution that gives the probability of certain values occurring given that the average value is like as such. Let's say like the average sort of like points scored in like a soccer game on like a small league is like 7. So like 7 goals are like scored every game. One can use a Poisson distribution using the fact that the average number of goals is like scored is 7. One can ask like, what's the probability that 5 goals would be scored in this game? Or like what's the probability that 0 goals would be scored in this game? What's the probability that 12 goals would be scored in this game? And by 7 goals I mean like the total number of goals scored, right? It could be like 3-4, 5-2 or something. So a Poisson distribution gives you a discrete distribution that peaks at the average value. The average value always has the highest probability. It's a discrete distribution that tells you what the probability is for a given number of whatever to occur, right? That it's used to model like discrete processes. And this like Poisson distributions are used to model like sort of like radioactive decay and many other like discrete processes. So remember that the sort of like recipient waits about Z blocks before verifying the transaction, right? Let's say that. Given that the recipient has waited like for Z blocks to be added to the honest chain, in the meantime, the attacker could have added like any number of like blocks to the attacker's chain. We know the average number of blocks that the attacker adds, right? And we call that lambda. And lambda equals Z times Q over P. And you're like, whoa, okay. Think of it this way, right? The proportion given like Z block, think of like Z spots or like 10 spots, right? If it's 10 spots, out of the 10 spots, like let's say like they're colored spots and like the two colors are like red and blue, right? If red occurs with like 30% probability and blue occurs with 70% probability. When we count the number of red spots, we should on average get 3 of them. And when we count the blue, we should on average get 7 of them. All of them could be red, all of them could be blue. All of them could be blue with a much higher probability than all of them being red. But on average, it's very probable that 7 of them would be blue in any order, and 3 of them would be red, right? So if we take 0.3 over 0.7, that's 3 over 7, right? The ratio of the probabilities is actually proportional to the ratio of the processes taking place. So it's it should be obvious that lambda, which is the number of steps that the attacker could take, over z equals q over p, right? So the ratio of the number of steps should be equal to the ratio of the probabilities. So lambda equals z times q over p. So lambda is our average, the average step that the malicious or the attacker's chain would gain. Okay, note that both lambda and z are fixed for a given z, right? Because lambda equals z times q over p. Q and p are given. Z is sort of fixed for a given z. So lambda is fixed for as the average sort of value. And it's going to be the mean value for the Poisson distribution as well. But given lambda, right, the attacker could generate any number of blocks and then add it while the recipient is sort of waiting for those z blocks that the honest nodes have added, right? But the average amount that the the attacker would add is lambda. The average number of steps is lambda, but it could add any number of those. And the probability that, let's say 100 steps have been added is given by the Poisson distribution with an average value lambda, average number of steps lambda. Let's say that the attacker has gained k steps, right, while the honest node has gained z steps, and let's say z is greater than k, right? So now the attacker has z minus k steps to catch up, right? So the whole probability of the attacker catching up depends on how many steps the attacker has sort of worked on as the honest nodes work on z steps, and then once that has happened, right, the attacker has to catch up on the z minus k steps, right? So this is very straightforward, right? It's first we have to calculate the probability that the attacker would have worked on k steps or k blocks and then added them or appended them to the attacker's chain, right? That's given by the Poisson distribution. The probability is given by the Poisson distribution. That probability times the probability that the attacker would catch up on those z minus k steps. And that's given by q over z to the power, q over p to the power of z minus k. And we've seen this before, right? Because at each step, the probability of the attacker sort of gaining an advance is q over p. So for the attacker to catch up, it's going to be q over p to the power of the number of steps that the attacker has to catch up, and that's z minus k. So on the whole, the probability is given by the Poisson distribution times q over p to the z minus k, where k is the number of steps that the attacker has worked on, while the honest nodes were worked on z steps, right? And this is for all q less than p. Since we have already assumed that the honest nodes have more computational power. So the first case is where the malicious or the attacking chain is shorter or lags behind the honest chain by z minus k. In the second case, where k is greater than z, it has already overtaken the honest node. The probability that it overtook the honest node is 1, since it has already taken it over. And so the probability would be the Poisson distribution of k being greater than z times 1. The last step would be to actually simplify what was given here to actually like compute the whole summation. And I think Satoshi has like a very like nifty sort of like trick to simplify this and sort of like make it quite amenable to like calculation and implementation and actual like programming. So the rearrangement starts as follows, right? So we have the summation, the Poisson probabilities, the Poisson distribution times k over p to the z minus k if k is less than z and 1 if k is greater than z. So the sort of like we have to actually like sum this whole thing for each case and then sum the whole thing again. So we can break it down into two parts, right? For z is less than or equal to z, for k is less than or equal to z, and for k is greater than z. And the sum goes as follows. So for this first part, just leave it there. It's a sum from k equals 0 to z, and for decent z as high as like 1,000 or 2, this could be implemented very like reasonably on like an average computer. But the last sum starts at z and it goes all the way to infinity. The contributing terms are gonna like dwindle. Like even like we'd have to take like a significant like amount of like steps to actually like get quite close to the actual value. But the brilliance of like Satoshi, I guess, here in this step is like it's actually, I wouldn't say it's brilliant, but it's very like cheeky. That Satoshi notices that like we can actually like take the complement probability and sort of like work this out, because we know that like this is like an infinite portion out of the sum of like the Poisson distribution. The Poisson distribution is obviously like a probability distribution, and this is a trick that is implemented quite often like in probabilistic and like statistic circles. Since the Poisson distribution is like a probability distribution, it's gonna sum to 1, like, right? It has to, like, the probability of anything happening is 1. Why not take 1 minus the remaining term? And the remaining term happens to be a finite sum, and lucky us, it's actually over the same range as the first term, so we can combine them easily, right? So we combine them, we simplify, and we get the last one that could be easily implemented. Beautiful. Now let's move on to the implementation of what we just worked out. Satoshi implements this in C. He includes like the math library, and he creates like a function, attacker success probability. It's gonna like run the scenario that we just considered, and initially like a sort of variable, a double variable q is defined and an integer variable z is defined. There's sort of inputs into this function. And obviously, p is like the complement probability to q. And it's, since q is a double and 1 is an integer, it must be a double. Then lambda, again, is, as we've discussed, is z times q over p. It's also a double, since q and p are doubles and z is an integer. And we initialize this variable called sum. We'll see like how it's used. Then we also initialize two integers that we will use for our for loops. They have no sort of, well, so we again initialize a variable called Poisson, and Poisson would be e to the minus lambda. And then if you notice like the sort of the second for loop inside the main for loop, actually, so it goes from like 1, I equals 1 to up to all the way to k, and like with increments of 1, and it multiplies these sequentially, and what we end up getting is like lambda over 1 times lambda over 2 times lambda over 3 up to lambda over k, and that obviously is lambda to the k over k factorial. So that is multiplied onto the initial Poisson, so we get all the multiplying term lambda to the k times e to the minus lambda over k factorial. So like that's the final form of Poisson, the variable, right? And that's what we need, and that times the sort of the term in parentheses there would yield the second term of our final result that we had before. And sum, remember, sum is 1, so the final sort of like output or result would be lambda to the k times e to the minus lambda over k factorial, that's the Poisson term, times 1 minus q over p to the z minus k. This whole thing
subtracted from 1. That's sum, and the function returns sum. So this whole function implemented, we can, like, Satoshi implements these for various sort of like feasible probabilities. And for 0.1, you can see that like it dies off at like z equals 10, right? And for q equals 0.3, it dies off at like z equals 50. And also, like, Satoshi also includes like Satoshi reckons that, okay, given like some q, what is the value of z such that p is less than 0.001? The probability of attacker success is less than 0.001. Remember, capital P is different from small letter p. They actually like have an antagonistic sort of dependence on. No, actually they have an antagonistic sort of like relationship with each other, right? The bigger sort of like and as you can see, like for like very high, let's say like the attacker controls 45% of the computational power, that kind of roughly translates to like 0.5% probability, and even then z equals 340 would be enough. That's incredible. And that's the whole paper for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.